Dory Miller was a mess attendant, second class, aboard the battleship USS West Virginia on December 7th, 1941, in Pearl Harbor. His actions that day were legendary. He helped carry many of his crew members to safety, including his captain. And then he took control of an anti-aircraft gun despite having no training in the weapon and defended his ship, shooting down at least one Japanese aircraft. He became a national hero overnight. Became the first black sailor to be awarded the Navy's highest award for valor in the face of the enemy, the Navy Cross. He was nominated for a Medal of Honor. Much less remembered was his death, just 2 years later, aboard the escort carrier USS Liscome Bay. Miller's death represented the risks faced by the young men who served aboard the ships that were derisively called Kaiser's Coffins. The fleet carriers, the Essex carriers, grabbed all the headlines with their sprawling air groups and their fast attacks. But the small carriers, the jeep carriers of the Casablanca class, they were the indispensable backbone of Allied naval operations.
The battle in which Dory Miller became a hero put the U.S. into a difficult position regarding naval aviation. In 1941, the U.S. had only 7 fleet aircraft carriers, a precious few, even considering that none had been lost at Pearl Harbor. More were being constructed, but fleet carriers took time to build, and their air groups required training. There was plenty of demand, but one in particular would obviously draw the Navy's attention. Convoys crossing the Atlantic were vulnerable to the wolf packs of Admiral Karl Dönitz' U-boats through what was called the Black Pit, or the Mid-Atlantic Gap, a vast stretch of roughly 1,000 miles that was outside the reach of land-based aircraft. Losses in the gap were devastating, and the obvious solution, escorting convoys with aircraft carriers, concerned Rear Admiral William F. Halsey, the U.S. fleet's commander, aircraft battle force. He worried that if his fleet carriers were immediately called to the Battle of the Atlantic, it would, Jeffrey D. Barlow explained in a 2013 edition of the U.S. Naval Institute Press, severely restrict both the training of naval aviators and the service's ability to transport Army and Navy aircraft to overseas bases. In December 1940, Halsey sent a memo to Admiral Harold R. Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, suggesting the procurement of suitable merchant vessels and their earliest conversion to auxiliary aircraft carriers. The following March, the U.S. Navy acquired the 12,000-ton displacement cargo liner Mormac Mail for experimental conversion into an aircraft carrier. Mormac Mail was a Type C-3 cargo ship, one of nearly 240 built according to a design by the U.S. Maritime Commission. Renamed USS Long Island, she was commissioned June 2, 1941. Long Island saw important service, delivering some of the first planes to Guadalcanal, the famous Cactus Air Force, and training pilots. She also proved the concept, something that was cemented when in July of 1943 she was reclassified CVE-1. CV was the Navy prefix for fixed-wing aircraft carriers, and E meant escort. More than 4 dozen CVEs were converted from C-3 ships and later from Cimarron-class fleet oilers. These carriers provided vital service in numerous roles, transporting aircraft, fighting U-boats, and helping to close the Mid-Atlantic Gap. Although Navy Captain Calvin D. Durgan noted, due to their low speed and lack of protection and light armament, it is considered hazardous to employ a CVE group in operation where there is likely to be an effective enemy opposition. The problem was that even these conversions could not come quickly enough. James L. Knowles, Jr. explained in Smithsonian Magazine in 2004, as the war was slowly shifting in the Allies' favor, the increasing number of naval operations demanded more escort carriers. In 1943, industrialist Henry J. Kaiser presented a solution. Kaiser was a self-made man, the son of a shoemaker. His paving company, Henry J. Kaiser Company Limited, was a primary contractor for the construction of the Hoover Dam. In 1940, Britain was facing difficulty supplying enough new ships to replace losses in the Battle of the Atlantic. Kaiser, never having built a ship, opened a shipyard and began building ships to meet this demand. He would revolutionize the way that ships were built. Dwight John Zimmerman explains in a 2021 article on the webpage Defense Media Network. Before Kaiser entered the business, ships were constructed from the keel up by one crew of workers, a process that took as long as 6 months. Kaiser adapted mass production techniques to shipbuilding, instituting modular construction and assembly techniques in which the ship sections were welded together instead of riveted. Kaiser and his shipyards were instrumental in designing and speeding production of the cargo ships called Liberty and later Victory ships. For that alone, he should be credited as one of the industrialists whose roles in winning the war were arguably more important than that of any given military commander. But in 1943, Kaiser argued that he could apply his methods to warships. Kaiser proposed a radical plan, building 50 purpose-designed escort carriers from the keel up using assembly line techniques. Knowles writes, Kaiser was already cranking out cargo-carrying Liberty ships in under 60 days each. He applied the same techniques to his escort carriers, assembling much of each ship from prefabricated sections. Despite initial skepticism from the Navy's Bureau of Ships, which doubted a shipyard could churn out complex warships so quickly, President Franklin D. Roosevelt championed the project. The result was the S-4, S-2, BB-3 design.
The first aircraft carrier to be launched from the yard of Henry Kaiser. Now geared for mass production, America's miracle shipbuilder promises to deliver 6 carriers a month.
The first ship of the class, USS Casablanca, CVE 55, built at the Kaiser Shipbuilding Company in Vancouver, Washington, launched November 3, 1942. Between then and July 1944, the shipyard delivered all 50 ships. At the peak of production, a new carrier was being commissioned every week. This industrial pace remains unmatched in naval history. It was an amazing achievement, proving that quantity has a quality all its own. The press dubbed the carriers, carrying a typical air group of 27 to 30 aircraft and roughly half the length and a third the displacement of an Essex-class fleet carrier, baby flat tops, or Jeep carriers. The British called them Woolworth carriers after the U.S. mercantile stores, a reference to them being mass-produced and relatively cheap. But the quantity came at a price. For example, most major warships used steam turbines, but the Casablanca ships were each fitted with 2 5-cylinder vertical Skinner uniflow reciprocating steam engines. This was a strategic choice. The production of high-precision reduction gears for turbines was a major bottleneck in U.S. industry, and Kaiser opted for the older, simpler engine technology that could be manufactured without competing for limited gear-cutting resources. The choice ensured the ships could be completed on schedule, but it also limited their top speed to roughly 19 to 20 knots. Speed is important in battle, and the speed cookie-cutter design and hurried production schedule made, Knowles explains, the sailors assigned to the ships uncomfortable. At least one old salt complained that the escort carrier designation CVE stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. The ships, 512 feet 3 inches long and displacing 10,900 long tons fully loaded, were also notoriously lightly armored, leading to an even grimmer nickname, Kaiser's Coffins. As it turns out, the Navy was not always able to limit the Casablancas to where there was not likely to be an effective enemy opposition. They played critical roles, but some in fact turned out to be combustible, vulnerable, and possibly expendable. For example, USS Liscome Bay. When the USS Lexington was sunk during the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 8, 1942, 216 crew members were killed. A month later, when USS Yorktown was sunk at the Battle of Midway, 141 officers and crewmen died. When Liscome Bay was sunk on November 24, 1943, 644 of her crewmen were lost. Knowles writes, the Liscome Bay set a grim record during the war for the greatest loss of life in the sinking of a U.S. carrier, yet few people know about the ship. Commissioned August 7, 1943, USS Liscome Bay, CVE 56, was the second ship of the Casablanca class to enter service. The website Pearl Harbor Tours writes that 2 months after starting her service in the Navy, Liscome Bay departed San Diego for Pearl Harbor to take part in initial drills and exercises. When finished, she joined Carrier Division 4 and sailed from Pearl Harbor with Task Force 52 to the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. It was the ship's first combat mission. The task force also included USS Coral Sea and USS Corregidor, the 3rd and 4th Casablanca-class vessels, to enter service. It was the first trial by fire of the Casablanca class. On November 20th, the invasion of Makin Atoll, part of the Gilbert Island chain roughly halfway between Hawaii and Australia, began. Liscome Bay was acting as the flagship of the division under the command of Rear Admiral Henry M. Mullenix. Knowles writes, for 4 days, the Liscome Bay's aircraft, joined by others from sister carriers the Coral Sea and the Corregidor, strafed and bombed Japanese positions on Makin. No enemy fighters challenged them, but as the days passed, the Liscome Bay's crew grew nervous. How long would their slow, thin-skinned carrier have to remain off Makin? At 4:30 a.m. on November 24th, the ship went to routine general quarters, and at 5:05 a.m. her flight crews prepared to launch at dawn. But unknown to them, the ship was being shadowed by the Japanese submarine I-175, newly arrived in the Gilbert Islands. Pearl Harbor Tours explains that approximately 05:10, a lookout aboard Liscome Bay spotted a torpedo rocketing towards the carrier escort. Moments later, it struck, detonating the bomb magazine. The explosion ripped through the ship, spreading shrapnel up to 5,000 yards away and raining debris on the nearby USS New Mexico. Captain Lunsford Lomax Hunter of the New Mexico later wrote, "The first indication of the hit was a bright, quick flash of fire, followed within 2 or 3 seconds by a great explosion and towering mass of fire which seemed to engulf the ship and brilliantly illuminated the surrounding area. This column of fire rose to a height of several hundred feet, carrying with it burning wreckage and fragments which showered down into the sea for several minutes on all sides. A second heavy explosion was seen and heard about 20 seconds after the first. When the cloud of fire lifted from the ship, she was seen to be a blazing wreck, with fires raging throughout her structure." The Liscome Bay sank in just 23 minutes, the victim of a single torpedo. Admiral Mullenix was killed. Ship Captain Irving D. Wiltse was killed. National hero Dory Miller was killed. Knowles writes, 77 pilots and crewmen of Composite Squadron VC-39 crossed the Liscome Bay's gangplank for the first time in San Diego. For over half of them, it would be a one-way trip. The battle to take Macon Island ended that day. 66 troops of the U.S. Army were killed in the battle, roughly 1/10 the losses of the crew of Liscome Bay. It was the first, but not the only loss, among the Casablancas. The defining moment for the Casablanca class came on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, in what is widely considered one of the most lopsided and heroic naval engagements in history. A task unit of 6 Casablanca carriers, including the Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Callanan Bay, Kitkin Bay, and Gambier Bay, along with 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, codenamed Task Force, or Taffy 3, found itself the only thing standing between the Japanese center force and the vulnerable American invasion beaches. Electrician's mate Orville Bethard, on board the St. Lo, recalled to the United States World War II Museum, "Our signalmen started blinking a message to the ships on the horizon to find out if they were friend or foe, and they didn't answer. After a few minutes, boom, they started shooting at us. Well, then we knew who they were." The Japanese force, led by the battleship Yamato, possessed overwhelming firepower. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 were designed to fight submarines and support ground trips, not to trade broadsides with 18-inch guns. Bert Tillman wrote in the Naval Institute Press in 2013, "The sprawling Battle of Leyte Gulf, begun so successfully 2 days before, had turned to hash for Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's task unit, known by its call sign, Taffy 3. The carriers immediately began launching their air groups. Lieutenant Commander Edward J. Huxtable, commander of Composite Squadron VC-10 aboard the Gambier Bay, was sitting alone in the wardroom when general quarters sounded. He recalled that Lieutenant Junior Grade John Holland rushed in and said, 'Captain, you'd better get up to the ready room in a hurry. They're already manning planes,' Tillman explains. Huxtable followed Holland into the passageway at a dead run. He asked what was happening. 'I don't know,' Holland replied, 'but all hell must be busting loose.' By the time they reached the deck, shells were landing amongst the carriers. As the planes were taking off, they got their first look at the fleet attacking them. Ensign Charles Dugan exclaimed on the radio, 'Oh, shit!' Taffy 3 started creating smoke, trying to obscure the vulnerable carriers from the Japanese fire. Bethard recalls shells coming so close to the St. Lo that out of the corner of my eye, here comes three big old shells that just went over the bow. One of the shell casings flopped over on our deck and rocked there for a while. They were that close. But the direction of the wind meant that the smoke couldn't protect Gambier Bay's flank, and she was receiving fire from the 8-inch guns of the Japanese cruisers. The ship was hit at least 15 times. Tillman notes, the most telling hits punctured boilers, opened a hole in the forward engine room, and began heavy flooding and destroyed steering. His ship afire and dead in the water, Captain Walter Bowser Viewig gave the order to abandon ship. The planes are in the air, but many have been forced to take off without loading ordnance. Many of Taffy 3's planes attacked with nothing but machine guns or dummy torpedoes to distract the Japanese gunners. While the desperate heroics of the destroyer USS Johnston and destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts are generally known, the planes of Taffy 3's carriers were perhaps more important to the surprising outcome. The Japanese commander, Admiral Takeo Kurita, became convinced that the force he was facing was much larger than it really was, and he retreated. But it was too late for Gambier Bay. The fires finally reached a torpedo-armed TBF Avenger on the deck, detonating more stored bombs. The ship capsized. Tillman writes, with her keel exposed to the sky, the men nearest to the carrier could clearly see the underwater damage she sustained. Several shell holes were visible, and the port screw was gone. The ship sank within 4 minutes of capsizing. 131 of her crew went down with her. The USS Gambier Bay holds the tragic distinction of being the only U.S. aircraft carrier sunk by enemy surface gunfire during the war. She stayed in formation, taking hit after hit from Japanese cruisers to buy time for the rest of the task unit. And yet the day was not over for the other carriers of Taffy 3. They'd survived dodging in and out of rain squalls. Shells had bracketed the USS St. Louis several times, but even as the cruisers and battleships retreated, the carriers came under air attack. The planes were from a special attack unit, and their tactic was new and terrifying. The U.S. Navy was being introduced to the Kamikaze. The website of the World War II Museum explains, following the gun battle, Beathard made his way below decks to get breakfast, and like many of his shipmates, felt safe as the Japanese fleet disappeared over the horizon. But as he made his way below, the ship's general quarters alarm screamed. He recalled, I stepped back outside and looked around, wondering where the Japanese fleet was. And there was no Japanese fleet. Out of a rain squall came one lone airplane, and this plane came in, and I saw that meatball on the side of it, so I knew it was Japanese. The plane was an A6M0, which struck the St. Louis with a bomb before crashing itself into the carrier deck. Beathard recalled the plane went through the wooden flight deck that we had and just exploded in the hangar deck. And then he crashed into the plane on deck, and that explosion on the hangar deck, we blew ourselves apart from there because we were gassing up planes. Bombs out, no real protection. Fire. The torpedo bay blew. More ordnance exploded as the order was given to abandon ship. Beathard made it overboard, but 143 of her crew were killed. USS St. Louis was the first U.S. ship to be sunk by a kamikaze. It would not be the last. Another victim was a Casablanca-class USS Omni Bay. On January 4, 1945, she was transiting the Sulu Sea to the west of the Philippines when she came under kamikaze attack. Jay Price of National Public Radio explained in 2023. The pilot drove straight out of the blinding sun, and the ship's gunners didn't have time to fire even once. The pilot released 2 bombs an instant before crashing into the ship. One punched through the flight deck and ignited the fully fueled aircraft in the hangar deck. The crew fought the fires for an hour, but the risk of more secondary explosions was too great. The order was given to abandon ship. The ship had to be scuttled by the destroyer USS Burns as a risk to navigation. 95 sailors were killed in the attack. Sadly, many survivors were taken aboard the light cruiser Columbia, which was subsequently attacked by kamikazes 2 days later, killing 7 survivors of the Omni Bay. A month later, on February 16th, the Casablanca-class USS Bismarck Sea was steaming east of Iwo Jima, along with sister ships Bacon Island, Lunga Point, Saginaw Bay, Rudyard Bay, and Anzio, its planes carrying out close air support in the battle on the island. 5 kamikazes, Mitsubishi G4Ms, attacked the Lunga Point. Fire from Bismarck Sea and Lunga Point destroyed 4, with slight damage to the Lunga Point. The 5th, however, switched targets at the last minute, coming in so low that the guns of Bismarck Sea couldn't depress low enough to target it. The plane crashed through the hangar deck and exploded near the magazines. The ship's steering was disabled. Crews desperately tried to fight the fire, but the fires caused the ship to glow against the darkness, and another kamikaze targeted her. The second hit killed much of the fire crew fighting and disabled the firefighting equipment. The order was given to abandon ship. She slipped beneath the waves 2 hours after the first hit. 318 of her crew died, many due to hypothermia in the water. Bismarck Sea was the last U.S. carrier to be sunk by enemy attack during the Second World War.
The CVEs, and especially the 50 ships of the Casablanca class, did yeoman's work during the Second World War, while the fleet carriers took all the glory. After the war, a few were transformed into helicopter carriers, but the small and slow vessels had trouble finding a place in a navy that was transitioning to jet fighters. The last to serve was USS Thetis Bay, which had been converted into an amphibious assault ship and was decommissioned in 1964. The ships of the Casablanca class and the sailors aboard them faced unique risks during the Second World War. Rear Admiral Ralph Ofstie, who commanded a CVE task force during the Second World War, noted the inherent weaknesses of the Casablancas. He said that The CVEs are not hard. They are, for all practical purposes, converted merchant hulls. They lack much of the compartmentation and the generally heavy build of normal combatant vessels designed to absorb punishment. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.